The day began like any other for Jonathan Harris. He had chosen not to announce his visit to the Crystal Peaks Hotel in New York. For the magnate, there is something invaluable about observing the daily workings of his empire unfiltered, without the layers of formality and performance that his presence typically invoked. Dressed in dark jeans, a simple black jacket, and worn sneakers, Jonathan walked briskly through the bustling streets of Manhattan, blending seamlessly with the crowds. As he approached the grand glass doors of the hotel, a sense of pride washed over him. The towering structure represented years of hard work, innovation, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. But that pride would be short-lived. "Excuse me, sir." A deep voice cut through his thoughts. Jonathan looked up to see a uniformed security guard blocking his path. The man, whose name tag read Marcus, stood tall, his broad shoulders squared. His expression, however, was far from welcoming. "Yes," Jonathan replied calmly, his hand already moving toward the door handle. Marcus shifted his stance, a trace of condescension creeping into his voice. "The main entrance is for hotel guests only." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, unsure if he had heard correctly. "I know. I'm here too." Marcus didn't let him finish. "Delivery is around the side," he said, nodding toward the alley. His tone was firm, dismissive. Jonathan blinked, momentarily stunned. "Delivery," he repeated. Marcus sighed, as if Jonathan were a particularly slow student. "Yeah, delivery. Kitchen staff, maintenance crew, same deal. Entrance is through the service door." The dismissal stung, but Jonathan held his composure. "I'm not here to make a delivery," he said evenly. "I'm here to—" "Look," Marcus interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but this is a five-star establishment. We can't just have anyone walking in off the street." Jonathan stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and anger bubbling beneath the surface. His voice dropped an octave, calm but firm. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus let out a short laugh. "Oh, here we go," he muttered under his breath. "Look, buddy, I don't have time for games. Just use the service entrance, or I'll have to call someone to escort you out." By now, several passers-by had paused, curious about the commotion. Jonathan felt the weight of their stares, a knot tightening in his chest. He glanced toward the lobby, where uniformed staff moved seamlessly, completely unaware of what was happening outside. "This is my hotel," Jonathan said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. Marcus froze for a moment, then scoffed. "Your hotel? Sure, and I'm the mayor of New York." He crossed his arms, his stance daring Jonathan to continue. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He wasn't one to flaunt his status, but this was crossing a line. "I'm Jonathan Harris," he said, enunciating each word. "Founder and CEO of the Crystal Peaks chain." For a moment, Marcus looked genuinely taken aback. But then his expression hardened, skepticism taking over. "Yeah, right," he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "If you're Jonathan Harris, where's your entourage? Your suit? Your Bentleys?" Jonathan took a step forward, the controlled fury in his eyes, making Marcus flinch slightly. "I don't need an entourage to walk into my own hotel," he said. "And I certainly don't need your permission." Marcus hesitated, clearly weighing his options. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Look, I don't know who you think you're fooling, but people like you don't own places like this." Jonathan's breath caught in his chest. "People like you." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Before Jonathan could respond, the glass doors swung open, and a petite woman with sharp features and a tailored blazer stepped outside. Her name tag read Sarah, general manager. Her eyes darted between Jonathan and Marcus, confusion etched on her face. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone professional but tinged with concern. Marcus straightened, gesturing toward Jonathan. "This guy's causing trouble. Says he owns the place." Sarah's brow furrowed, and then her gaze shifted to Jonathan. Recognition dawned instantly, her face paling. "Mr. Harris?" she stammered. Jonathan nodded curtly. "Good afternoon, Sarah." The color drained from Marcus's face as he watched the exchange. "Wait, what?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. Sarah turned to Marcus, her professional demeanor cracking under the weight of her anger. "Are you telling me you didn't recognize the owner of this hotel?" she demanded. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His confidence, so evident moments ago, had vanished. "Mr. Harris, I am so sorry," Sarah said, turning back to Jonathan. "Please come inside. I'll handle this immediately." Jonathan held up a hand, his gaze fixed on Marcus.
"Not yet," he said.
His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that silenced everyone around him. "I want to hear what he has to say." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Jonathan's stare almost unbearable. I didn't know," he stammered. "You weren't dressed. I didn't think." Jonathan cut him off. "You didn't think someone who looks like me could own a place like this?" His voice was measured, but the accusation was unmistakable. Marcus's mouth opened and closed, struggling to form a coherent response. The onlookers, now numbering half a dozen, watched in stunned silence. Sarah stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "Marcus, I think it's best if you step inside."
"Now?"
Jonathan's hand stopped her.
"No."
"Let him speak." Marcus swallowed hard, his earlier bravado gone. I didn't mean it like that," he mumbled. "I was just following protocol." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Protocol? Is there a protocol for humiliating someone in public? For making assumptions based on how they look?" Marcus looked down, unable to meet Jonathan's gaze. "I'm sorry," he muttered. Jonathan let the words hang in the air, their inadequacy glaringly obvious. Finally, he straightened his jacket, his tone cold but composed. "Sarah, let's go inside. We'll talk about this later." As Sarah led him into the lobby, Jonathan glanced over his shoulder at Marcus, whose face was a portrait of shame and regret. The security guard stood frozen, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a vice. Inside, the polished marble floors and gleaming chandeliers of the Crystal Peaks lobby were a stark contrast to the scene that had just unfolded outside. Jonathan felt the eyes of the staff on him, their curiosity and unease palpable. He straightened his shoulders, every step deliberate. "Mr. Harris," Sarah began, her voice tentative. "I can't tell you how sorry I am. This is unacceptable, and I'll make sure." Jonathan stopped walking and turned to face her. "This isn't just about me, Sarah," he said. "What happened out there? That's a symptom of a much bigger problem. And I intend to fix it." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "Of course. Whatever you need, I'll make it happen." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. His mind was already racing, formulating a plan. One thing was clear, this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Not this time. The atmosphere in the Crystal Peaks Hotel was suffocating. Word of the incident at the entrance spread quickly, whispers rippling through the staff like an electric current. By the time Jonathan reached the executive meeting room on the second floor, every department head had already heard a version of the story. Jonathan sat at the head of the long, polished table, his face an unreadable mask. Sarah hovered near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy. One by one, the department heads filed in, each wearing a look that ranged from confusion to outright panic. "Take a seat," Jonathan said calmly, though his tone left no room for argument. As the team settled, the room fell into an uneasy silence. No one dared to speak. Jonathan allowed the discomfort to linger for a moment before leaning forward, his fingers interlaced on the table. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "What happened today is unacceptable." Heads bowed slightly, like school children awaiting reprimand. Sarah glanced around nervously, unsure if she should interject. "Marcus," Jonathan continued, his eyes locking on the man who had been summoned to the meeting as part of the security team. The security guard sat at the far end of the table, his shoulders hunched and his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'd like you to explain what happened." Marcus cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake, sir." "A mistake?" Jonathan repeated, his tone sharper now. "That's all you think this was?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I I didn't recognize you, he said, fumbling with his words. You weren't dressed like what? Jonathan interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Like someone who could own this place? Marcus's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply.
I don't care how I was dressed.
I could have been wearing a three-piece suit or a hoodie. The question is, why did you assume I didn't belong? I was following protocol, Marcus said weakly, but his words carried no conviction. Protocol? Jonathan repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. He gestured toward Sarah. Sarah, is it protocol to humiliate people at the door? To make assumptions based on how they look? Sarah shook her head vehemently. Absolutely not, Mr. Harris. Our policy is to welcome every guest with respect. Exactly, Jonathan said, his gaze snapping back to Marcus. So, again, I ask you, what made you think it was okay to treat me or anyone else that way? Marcus stared at the table, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, he muttered, I didn't mean to offend anyone. Jonathan's fist hit the table, the sound echoing through the room. Everyone jumped. Didn't mean to offend? Jonathan said, his voice now steely with anger. Do you think that excuses what happened? That an apology erases the humiliation you caused? Marcus looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and guilt. I didn't know, okay? I didn't know it was you. Jonathan's expression hardened. So, if I had been someone else, someone who wasn't the owner, you would have still treated me that way? Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence spoke volumes. Jonathan sat back, his gaze sweeping over the room. And that, he said, his voice quieter now but no less powerful, is exactly the problem. This isn't just about me. This is about every single person who walks through those doors. What happened today shows me that we have a much bigger issue here than one employee's mistake. Sarah cleared her throat tentatively. Mr. Harris, I take full responsibility for what happened. As the manager, it's my job to ensure that our staff represents the values of this company. Jonathan turned to her, his expression softening slightly. I appreciate that, Sarah. But this isn't just about you either. This is about the culture we've allowed to grow here. Somewhere along the line, we've forgotten what this brand stands for. The room was silent again, the weight of Jonathan's words pressing down on everyone present. Marcus, Jonathan said finally, turning his attention back to the guard. I want to hear more. Why did you assume I didn't belong? Marcus hesitated, visibly torn between his pride and the crushing reality of his mistake. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice shaky. I've had bad experiences, he admitted. At my last job, I was accused of stealing because of the way I look. They didn't even give me a chance to explain. Jonathan's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. And that made you think it's okay to treat others the same way? Marcus shook his head, shame washing over him.
No.
I guess I've been so defensive for so long that I didn't even realize what I was doing. Jonathan nodded slowly, digesting the man's words. Do you understand the irony of that? That you let your own pain make you part of the problem? Marcus looked down, his hands clenching into fists. I do now. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The difference between you and me, Marcus, is that I've been where you are. I've faced the same assumptions, the same indignities. But I made a choice. I chose not to let it define me or how I treat others. Marcus swallowed hard, his face a portrait of regret. I'm sorry, Mr. Harris. Truly. I didn't mean for this to happen. Jonathan stared at him for a long moment before nodding. I believe you. But words alone aren't enough. Actions matter. He turned to the rest of the room. That goes for all of us. Starting today, things are going to change. Every single person in this hotel, every department, every role will go through mandatory training on diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias. No exceptions. The room erupted into murmurs, but Jonathan silenced them with a raised hand. This isn't up for debate. If we're going to call ourselves a leader in hospitality, we need to live up to that title, not just in how we treat our guests, but in how we treat each other. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. I expect updates on the training schedule by the end of the week. And Marcus, he said, his voice firm but not unkind, your participation in this process will determine whether you have a future here. Marcus nodded, his face pale but resolute. Yes, sir. I understand. Jonathan looked around the room one last time. Let today serve as a wake-up call. This is about more than business. It's about who we are and who we want to be. With that, he walked out, leaving the room in a stunned silence. As the door closed behind him, Marcus let out a shaky breath, the enormity of the moment sinking in. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. The training sessions began the following week. They were mandatory, rigorous, and, as Jonathan had promised, left no room for complacency. Employees from all departments attended in groups, sitting in the hotel's expansive conference room as professional facilitators guided them through scenarios, discussions, and deeply uncomfortable truths about unconscious bias. Marcus found himself seated at the back of the room during the first session, his posture stiff and his arms crossed. Around him, other employees shifted uncomfortably as the facilitator, a poised woman named Camille, played a video depicting an eerily familiar scene. A guest, assumed to be a delivery person based on their appearance, was treated dismissively by hotel staff.
Camille paused the video.
What do we think happened here? She asked, her eyes scanning the room. The room was silent. Marcus stared at the table in front of him, avoiding her gaze. Anyone's?
Camille pressed.
Why do you think the staff treated this guest differently? A young housekeeper, sitting near the front, hesitantly raised her hand. They'd assumed he didn't belong, she said quietly. Exactly, Camille replied, nodding. And what do assumptions like that tell us? About ourselves? About how we view others? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Marcus shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The truth was hitting too close to home. By the end of the session, he felt emotionally drained. Yet, as much as he hated to admit it, he also felt the stirrings of something else. Clarity. A week later, Jonathan decided it was time to address the staff directly. Sarah arranged for a company-wide meeting in the hotel ballroom, the largest space available. Employees stood shoulder to shoulder, filling every corner of the room. The air buzzed with anticipation and, for many, nervousness. Jonathan rarely addressed his teams in such a public manner. When he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Dressed simply, his presence alone commanded attention. He let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. I've built this company on a single, unwavering belief, he began, his voice steady, that every person who walks through our doors deserves to feel valued, respected, and seen. He paused, scanning the crowd. But what happened last week reminded me that we're not living up to that belief. And that failure isn't just about one incident or one employee. It's about all of us. The culture we've created, or failed to create. Jonathan's voice softened. I know what it feels like to be dismissed, to be judged for things I can't control. And I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone. In the audience, Marcus felt the weight of the words like a punch to the gut. He thought back to his own experiences, the ones he had shared with Jonathan during their tense conversation. He had spent so long protecting himself that he had become blind to the damage he was causing others. Jonathan's voice rose again, cutting through Marcus's thoughts. But I also believe in redemption. I believe people can learn, grow, and change if they're willing to face the hard truths about themselves. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his eyes scanning the audience. Marcus, he said, his voice steady. Would you join me up here? A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Marcus froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He had hoped to avoid the spotlight, to quietly prove himself through actions, not words. But now every eye was on him. Slowly he stood. The walk to the stage felt impossibly long, the weight of his shame pressing down on him with every step. When he reached Jonathan, he avoided his gaze, staring out at the sea of faces instead. Jonathan placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus and I had a conversation after what happened, he said. And I learned something important. Marcus hasn't just made mistakes, he's also been a victim of the same kind of bias he showed that day. The crowd was silent, the tension palpable. "Marcus," Jonathan said, turning to face him, "I'd like you to share your story." "If you're ready." Marcus swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, and for a moment, he considered refusing. But then he saw Camille in the crowd, her eyes steady and encouraging. He took a deep breath and began. "At my last job," he said, his voice shaky but growing steadier, "I was accused of stealing because of how I looked. I'd been working there for years, but one mistake, a register that came up short, was all it took for them to pin it on me. No questions asked." He paused, his eyes darting nervously across the crowd. "They didn't even investigate. They just fired me. And after that, no one would hire me. I lost everything." There was a murmur of sympathy from the crowd, but Marcus pressed on. "When I got this job, I told myself I'd never let anyone make me feel that way again. But instead of dealing with my own pain, I let it turn into something worse. I started making assumptions about people just like they did to me." His voice broke slightly on the last words. Jonathan gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I'm not proud of what I did," Marcus continued, his voice steadier now. "But I'm trying to change. I want to do better, not just for myself, but for everyone I meet." When he finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, people began to clap. The applause grew louder, swelling into a wave of support that seemed to wash over Marcus. For the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten: forgiveness. Jonathan stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the applause. "Marcus's story is a reminder that we're all human. We all carry baggage, make mistakes, and fall short. But we also have the capacity to grow, to choose empathy over judgment." He looked out at the crowd, his voice resolute. "That's what I want this company to stand for. Not just luxury or success, but humanity." As the applause resumed, Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. He had come to work that morning expecting to feel small, humiliated. Instead, he felt something unexpected: hope. After the meeting, employees lingered in the ballroom, discussing what they had heard. Many approached Marcus, offering words of encouragement or sharing their own stories. Camille found him near the back of the room, where he stood awkwardly, unsure of how to process the outpouring of support. "You did good," she said, smiling warmly. Marcus nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks. I didn't think anyone would care." Camille tilted her head, studying him. "People care when you're honest. That's what makes change possible." As Marcus left the ballroom that day, he felt a cautious optimism he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he believed in the possibility of a future where his past didn't define him, and where he could, maybe, be proud of the man he was becoming. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change for the staff at Crystal Peaks. The diversity training continued in full swing, accompanied by smaller workshops and one-on-one discussions. Employees who had rarely spoken to one another were now engaged in candid, sometimes uncomfortable conversations. The hotel, which had prided itself on its glossy exterior, was finally confronting its deeper flaws. For Marcus, the journey was far from easy. Though the staff's reaction to his story had been overwhelmingly supportive, he still carried the weight of his actions. He couldn't shake the memory of Jonathan's eyes that day, disappointed, questioning, yet somehow forgiving. The road to redemption, Marcus realized, was much longer than a single meeting. One afternoon, Marcus was stationed at the front desk, temporarily reassigned while a new security team underwent evaluations. Sarah approached him with a clipboard, her expression as sharp as ever but softened with a hint of warmth. "Marcus," she said, handing him a piece of paper, "Mr. Harris has scheduled a private meeting with the management team, and he's asked for you to attend." Marcus froze. "Me?" he asked, incredulous. "Yes, you," Sarah replied, her tone firm. "Be in the boardroom at 2 p.m. sharp. And Marcus," she added, lowering her voice, "you've earned this. Don't let your doubts get in the way." Her words stayed with him as he nervously made his way to the meeting later that day. The boardroom, with its panoramic view of Manhattan, was already filled with department heads when Marcus arrived. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding but not overbearing. "Marcus," Jonathan said, gesturing for him to take a seat near the front. "Glad you could join us." Marcus sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel the eyes of the other managers on him, some curious, others skeptical. Jonathan began the meeting with updates on the training programs and plans to implement new policies. But then, to Marcus's surprise, the conversation shifted. "Before we move forward," Jonathan said, his gaze sweeping the room, "I want to revisit what this incident has taught us, not just about our guests, but about how we treat each other as a team." He turned to Marcus. "Would you mind sharing your perspective? What have you learned over these past few weeks?" The room went silent. Marcus's mouth went dry, but he knew this was an opportunity he couldn't waste. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the tension. "I've learned that sometimes the hardest person to face is yourself," Marcus began. "When you've been hurt, it's easy to put up walls and assume the worst about people. But that doesn't make it right. I let my own pain cloud my judgment, and I hurt others because of it." He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each manager in turn. "I also learned that change isn't just about policies or training sessions. It's about taking a hard look at the culture we create every day, how we treat our coworkers, our guests, and even ourselves." Jonathan nodded, his expression unreadable. "And how do we move forward from here?" Marcus hesitated, then spoke with quiet conviction. "By holding each other accountable. By listening, even when it's uncomfortable. And by remembering that we're not just here to do a job, we're here to make people feel like they matter." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Marcus. "Well said." Later that evening, as Marcus prepared to leave for the day, he found Jonathan waiting for him in the lobby. The two men hadn't spoken privately since their confrontation, and Marcus felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. "Got a minute?" Jonathan asked, gesturing toward a quiet corner of the lobby. Marcus nodded, following him. They sat down on a sleek leather couch, the bustling sounds of the hotel fading into the background. "I wanted to thank you," Jonathan said, his tone sincere. "What you said in the meeting today, it mattered. Not just to me, but to everyone in that room." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know if I deserve the credit. I'm just trying to fix what I broke." Jonathan studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "You didn't break this on your own, Marcus. What happened that day at the door, it was wrong, no question. But it didn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a bigger problem that I let go unchecked for too long." Marcus looked at him, surprised. "You think you're to blame?" "I think we all are in some way," Jonathan replied. "Leadership isn't just about setting rules, it's about setting an example. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're all still learning, myself included." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. For weeks, he had carried the burden of his actions alone, convinced that he was the sole villain in the story. Hearing Jonathan take responsibility, even in part, felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly. Jonathan smiled. "Don't thank me yet. There's still work to do. For both of us." As the weeks went on, the atmosphere at Crystal Peaks began to shift. Employees who had once avoided eye contact with Marcus now greeted him with nods or even smiles. He found himself volunteering for extra training sessions, eager to absorb everything he could. Slowly but surely, he started to believe in his own capacity for change. Meanwhile, Jonathan pushed forward with broader reforms. He launched an initiative to partner with organizations that focused on equity in hospitality, ensuring that Crystal Peaks set a new standard for the industry. He also began hosting monthly town halls with employees, giving everyone a voice in shaping the company's future. One of the most surprising developments, however, came from Marcus himself. Inspired by the training sessions and his own journey, he approached Sarah with an idea, a mentorship program for new hires, focusing on empathy and inclusion. Sarah brought the idea to Jonathan, who approved it without hesitation. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked Jonathan one afternoon as they discussed the program in his office. "I'm sure," Jonathan said, his voice steady. You have something valuable to offer, Marcus. Don't underestimate yourself. For the first time in a long while, Marcus didn't doubt those words. Months had passed since the incident at the Crystal Peaks entrance, and the changes within the hotel were palpable. What began as an uncomfortable reckoning had evolved into a transformation, not just for the employees, but for the culture of the entire organization. Guests remarked on the warmth and attentiveness of the staff, and employees began to take pride in their work in a way they hadn't before. For Jonathan, the journey had been both challenging and deeply rewarding. Walking through the hotel one sunny afternoon, he observed the team interacting with guests and with each other. There was a new energy in the air, a sense of camaraderie and purpose that hadn't existed before. As he approached the lobby, his attention was drawn to Marcus, who was standing by the front desk. A family with 2 young children had just checked in, and Marcus crouched down to the children's eye level, handing them small stuffed animals emblazoned with the Crystal Peaks logo. The kids' faces lit up, and their parents smiled appreciatively. Jonathan allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction before stepping forward. Marcus, he said, his voice warm. Marcus straightened immediately, turning toward Jonathan with a smile. Mr. Harris.
Good to see you.
Jonathan gestured toward the family as they walked away. That was a nice touch. Marcus shrugged modestly. It's nothing really. Just trying to make people feel welcome. You're doing a lot more than that, Jonathan said, his tone serious now. I've been hearing great things about the mentorship program. The feedback's been incredible. Marcus nodded, a flicker of pride crossing his face. The program's been different, but in a good way. It's not just about training, it's about listening, learning from each other. I've even learned things I didn't realize I needed to. Jonathan's expression softened. That's leadership, Marcus. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to grow. The words landed heavily, and Marcus nodded again, this time with more confidence. Thank you for giving me the chance to prove I could be better. Jonathan smiled. You didn't need my permission, Marcus. You just needed to believe it yourself. That evening, the hotel staff gathered in the ballroom for a special event, a celebration of the company's progress. Jonathan had insisted on keeping it casual, with employees encouraged to bring their families and enjoy an evening of food, music, and camaraderie. As the night wore on, Jonathan took the stage to address the crowd. The room quieted as he spoke. I want to thank all of you, he began, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation. What we've accomplished here over the past few months isn't just about policies or training, it's about people. It's about choosing to be better, not just for ourselves, but for each other. He paused, letting his gaze travel across the room. What happened that day at the entrance could have torn us apart. It could have made us bitter, resentful, or afraid. But instead, it brought us together. It forced us to look at ourselves and ask hard questions. And because of that, we've grown stronger. Jonathan gestured toward Marcus, who stood near the back of the room. Marcus is a testament to that growth. He faced his mistakes head-on and chose to learn from them. And because of his courage, he's become a leader in this team. The room erupted into applause, and Marcus, visibly moved, gave a small, self-conscious wave. But this isn't just about Marcus, or me, or any one person, Jonathan continued. It's about all of us. It's about creating a place where everyone feels seen, valued, and respected. And that's something we'll keep striving for every day. As the applause swelled again, Jonathan stepped off the stage, blending back into the crowd. Employees approached him throughout the evening, sharing stories of how the changes had impacted them personally. Later that night, as the event wound down, Jonathan found himself alone in the lobby. The space was quiet now, the grand chandeliers casting soft light over the polished floors. He stood near the entrance, looking out at the bustling city beyond the glass doors. Sarah approached him, a glass of sparkling water in her hand. "Penny for your thoughts," she asked, offering him the drink. Jonathan took it, smiling faintly, just thinking about how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. Sarah nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "It's never finished, is it? Building something better?" "No," Jonathan agreed. "But that's what makes it worth it. They stood in silence for a moment before Sarah spoke again. You know, Marcus told me something interesting the other day. He said that for the first time in years, he feels like he's part of something bigger than himself. Jonathan's smile widened. That's the point, isn't it? To build something that lifts everyone up. Sarah raised her glass in a small toast. To lifting everyone up. Jonathan clinked his glass against hers. To lifting everyone up. As he left the hotel that night, Jonathan walked through the same doors where the incident had occurred months ago. This time, the doorman greeted him warmly, holding the door open with a genuine smile. "Good night, Mr. Harris," the man said. Jonathan returned the smile, stepping out into the cool night air. The city buzzed around him, alive with possibility. And as he walked down the street, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had turned a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change, proving that even the hardest lessons could lead to something extraordinary. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt hopeful for his company, for his team, and for the world they were building together.